Right, good morning everybody. Hi and welcome to our first ever LUPC and SUPC webinar day. I'm Emma Keenan, the Deputy Director of LUPC, and on behalf of both of the consortia, I'd really like to welcome you and say it's great to have you here. I hope you're all well and adapting to this new norm that we have of home working and the joys of Teams and Zoom and other online technology that we've all been forced to get to grips with. As many of you know, LUPC and SUP's annual conference was due to take place on the 30th of this month. As we've been unable to proceed with the conference in this way, we want to ensure that we can continue to provide support to our members at this difficult time. So today's sessions, this morning we have a number of webinars on addressing key challenges that our members are facing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We'd like to say a big thank you to Legal Services Framework Supplier VWV, who are not only sponsoring today's programme, but are also running the morning sessions. Their support and expertise are really valued, particularly at this time. The morning is broken into 3 sessions. The first will cover guidance on PPN 01 and 02, and please note that any queries you have provided to your consortium or in HEPA's Time to Talk session on the 6th of April have been forwarded to VWV, so this will have informed their presentation. The second session covers force majeure, frustration and contract management, and the final session is a Q&A panel. It will address all the questions raised by you either in advance of today or via the Q&A function on Zoom that you'll be able to see. There'll be a comfort break of 5 minutes between each of the VWV sessions, and you can grab a coffee. At this point, you'll see a holding slide on your screens. We'll then have a couple of hours break for lunch, and we'll resume with programming in the afternoon. The afternoon's programming speaks to the heart of our individual team and organisational responses to the challenges that COVID-19 has thrown up. Our colleagues at SUMS Consulting will be leading 2 sessions. The first is on the principles of successful change management, and the second will explore personal resourcefulness during COVID-19. Please make sure you come back and join us via the appropriate Zoom links for these sessions. So the first of those will kick off at 2 o'clock. So as well as today's webinar, we're also delivering key content planned for our conference online on the 30th. You will receive more information on this in the next few days, but I can tell you that our keynote speaker, Professor Albert Sanchez-Grales, Professor of Economic Law at the University of Bristol Law School and a member of the European Procurement Law Group, is on board. So we're delighted that due to the use of Zoom technology, we have been able to open up the LUPC and SUPC webinars to all of the members of UK UPC nationally. That includes members of APUC, HEPQ, NEUPC, NWUPC, TUCO and TEC. I guess one of the positive outcomes of the situation we're currently facing is the opportunity to really pull together as a sector. So just a few technical points which will be useful for anyone not yet familiar with Zoom. As we've got a large number of participants registered for today's webinars, we have disabled some of the Zoom features for participants in order to streamline this, make it good content for you. The audio, video and ability to use the notes function for all communicating with participants has been disabled. You can, however, use the notes function for flagging any technical issues to the panelists, and these will be picked up by Michael and Grace on the panel, who are our techies for today. You can raise questions for VWV by typing them in the Q&A function. If you move your cursor on the screen, a menu will appear at the bottom where you can see Q&A and you can type your questions in there. We recommend that you wait to the end of each session before asking your questions, as they may well be addressed within the presentation. Participants have the option to vote for a question that you're interested in by just clicking on the thumbs up icon on the question. This will enable the panel to see which questions are the most important to the audience. And please note that questions raised during the presentations will not be answered immediately, will be addressed during the VWV panel session. We are recording the webinars, and the recordings will be made available to attendees and UK UPC members, and presentation slides will also be shared. I hope you enjoy today's webinars. Without further ado, I'll hand you over to Stephanie Rickard, who is the partner at VWV, for her guidance presentation covering guidance on PPNs. Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Emma. And hello from sunny Bristol. Thank you very much for attending the webinar. It's great so many contacts and clients are here joining us today. I'd like to say a particular thank you to LUPC for making this possible in such a short period of time. We've received dozens of queries from higher education institutions, schools, museums and cultural institutions about the PPNs that have been issued in the last couple of weeks. So the objectives of the session today, and Grace, if I could ask you to go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The objectives of this session are to provide an overview of the procurement policy notices, to provide some practical guidance on how the PPNs work and things that you need to take into account. And also, as evidenced by the huge number of questions that we've received from delegates, to try and answer some of those questions. It's obvious that the Cabinet Office issued the PPNs in haste, and totally understandable given the current situation, but we've identified a number of areas where we think that it would be helpful to have further clarification. So we'll discuss some of those areas as well. Going on to the next slide. Hopefully we should have a slide now which sets out the Cabinet Office procurement policy notes, and I checked last night to make sure that this list was still up to date. As you've been aware, the list has been changing quite regularly as Cabinet Office updates the guidance note. We're going to talk about Procurement Policy 120, which talks about some of the procurement tools for helping manage procurements to deal with COVID-19 issues. And then the one that's caused a lot of queries is Procurement Policy Note 220, which is supply relief for COVID-19. Now, many of you will be aware that the main guidance note, which as an overview requires contracting authorities to put in place measures to ensure supplier cash flow, has a number of guidance notes under it. So the Model Interim Payment Terms is a very useful document which sets out a mechanism for putting in place agreed measures with suppliers. There is also a contingent workers guidance note. Now, this is aimed at agency workers who have been employed by the public sector to carry out particular assignments. And it sets out a scheme which is similar to the furlough arrangements that have been put in place more widely by the government, but in fact it's a slightly different regime, and that has been updated in the last week or so. The FAQs was a document that was issued about 2 weeks ago, that provided some further guidance from Cabinet Office because they've been inundated with lots of queries about Procurement Policy 220. And then last week on the 7th of April, there was a final update which included model construction terms and FAQs. So there's a slightly different regime for construction type contracts. We're not actually going to deal with those today, but I just wanted to make you aware of them. Right, going to the next slide. It's always really important, I think, when you're dealing with a new issue, to go back to the source of the legislation, because that helps you work through the procurement assessment. Just a quick reminder about the legislative framework. Obviously, we've still got the EU treaty and principles that apply during the transitional period. But what I really wanted to flag up on the next slide is the EU core principles. Because the EU core principles of fairness, transparency, non-discrimination and proportionality, I think, will really underpin all of the decision-making process that you're going to be taking. And I think if you have those common sense principles at the back of your mind, that'll really help you decide how best to implement these PPNs. Now, one of the common questions that has been raised is, do the PPNs apply to me? Going on to the next slide, please. So what is the status of the PPNs? Well, the original notices said they'd applied to contracting authorities in England, and they expressly mentioned central government, non-departmental public bodies, and local authorities, but they were silent in relation to the higher education institutions and schools. Now, we actually raised a query with Cabinet Office about whether higher education authorities were included, and in fact they subsequently issued, as a response to the frequently answered questions guidance, the response that all contracting authorities were intended to be covered by the guidance notes. Now, it's interesting because I suppose the question then follows, well, what are the consequences if I don't actually apply the guidance? If you look at chapters 8 and 9 of the Public Contracts Regulations 2015, and these are the provisions that were introduced by UK government in addition to the treaty provisions, it requires you to have regard to guidance issued by Cabinet Office. So the potential remedies if you don't comply with the PPNs, I think that one, you could be, a complaint could be made, suppliers could make a complaint to the procurement review service, which used to be known as mystery shoppers. The other potential is that you could have a supplier seek to claim breach of statutory duty under the public procurement regulations with the remedy of damage. Now, although it might be difficult to make a claim, there is the possibility of a claim being made. We had a question about whether the particularly PPN 220 applies to overseas suppliers. And I thought that was a really good question. My view is that it is likely to apply to overseas suppliers because the whole purpose of PPN 220 is to ensure continuity of the supply chain. And in fact, going back to the core principles that I referred to earlier, if it didn't apply to overseas suppliers, there would be an argument that that was discriminatory. Now, there's an interesting position that a number of you will be in. If you are a university who has decided that you are not caught by the procurement rules as a contracting authority due to the way that you are financed, particularly if the majority of your income comes from student loans. Now, the guidance on this is, as I say, strictly applies to contracting authorities. My view at the moment is that non-contracting authorities are are not bound by the guidance, that they should continue to apply it as best practice. I'm aware that a lot of universities will have a similar procurement regime in place to the procurement rules. And actually, going back to the whole point of the regulations, it's in your interest to ensure continuity of supply. So going now in to look at the PPNs in more detail, I'm going to start talking about PPN 120 on the next slide. As you are aware, PPN 120 sets out a toolbox for addressing some of the procurement routes that you can apply to assist you with some of the challenges of COVID-19. And it must be a particularly stressful time for you all at the moment with such a lot going on. There are 5 measures which the PPN talks about. And Grace, if you go through to the next slide, please. Thank you. I think, from my point of view, the one that is most interesting is the first one, because the PPN seems to give permission for the extreme urgency provision under Regulation 32 to be used in response to COVID-19. I'm going to talk about that test on the next slide because it is quite a difficult test to apply. Sorry, if we could just go back to the previous slide. Thank you. It's also worth noting that the accelerated procedure, which allows you to reduce time scales for carrying out a procurement process under the open procedure to 25 days and to 15 days for the restricted procedure, might be useful. There has been quite a lot of discussion about single source exemption, where there is only one particular supplier who can provide kit, and there may well be circumstances where, for example, you might have particular drugs where you can only have particular single sources. But again, it has to be used sparingly. I've never been a particular fan of DPS, dynamic purchasing systems, in the past, but actually I can see now that the ability for suppliers to come online and to, in real time, talk about the availability of products now in an ever-changing climate can be really useful. So a reminder that people looking to procure goods and services can carry on calling off under frameworks and under DPSs. And it's very likely that you'll be wanting to look to see whether you can extend particular contracts, if it's not possible to carry out procurements, to extend existing contracts, because it may take longer for procurements to be carried out, and also to take into account changes as a result of PPN 220. So going to the next slide, just a reminder of the test that you need to satisfy if you're going to rely on the extreme urgency exemption. There have been lots of cases where contracting authorities have tried to rely on the extreme urgency exemption, and they've been challenged by suppliers. And I'm not aware of any case to date where the justification has been met. But clearly, COVID-19 is an extreme set of circumstances. So if you have a particular requirement, for example, hand sanitizer is a really good example. I saw a fantastic picture on LinkedIn of one of the universities who just managed to secure a whole load of supplies of hand sanitizer, and that seems to me a good example of where the extreme urgency exemption might be applicable. But where people normally fall down is you need to satisfy yourself that the urgency is not contributed to by the contracting authority, and that's where in the case law a lot of the contracting authorities have failed to demonstrate that to act quickly enough in response to a situation, and that you need to be able to demonstrate that you can't use the accelerated procedures. So whilst it is available, I think in practice likely to be limited to really essential works, supplies and services. Now there are a number of areas that I think COVID-19 gives rise to practical issues in how you manage procurement. So I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about those particular areas. So going on to the next slide, I wanted to look at some of the issues that may potentially reflect you procurement officers wanting to start new, carry out new procurements. Very often you're going to want to carry out market testing, but you're going to be limited in the way that you can do that. You're going to need to make sure that any market testing complies with the principles of fairness, transparency and discrimination. And obviously there's the ability to have meetings online and perhaps via webinars, but it's not going to be so easy to have those face-to-face meetings. Whilst the use of the accelerated procedure is available, I think you've also got to consider whether in practice it's fair to ask contractors to be able to provide all the necessary information in order to be able to respond to a tender within those very tight time frames. I was talking to a client the other day who said that they are looking at going out to procure a contract for maintenance, and very often they would invite suppliers to come around and look at the particular building to assess the state of maintenance. Now that's something that can't happen under the current circumstances, so you may want to think about putting assumptions in your procurement documents to cover that situation. The other aspect to consider, particularly if you're looking at an outsourcing contract, is whether or not there's going to be any interest from parties in particularly bidding for contract, because they're going to be worried about taking on 2P liability. And if there is a break between one contract that terminates and going out to a new procurement, then the contracting authority may find that it's taking responsibility for 2P in the interim. So going on to the next slide, I think this is one of the areas which really hasn't been covered at all by the PPN, which is what do you about in-flight procurements. I think one of the issues is that in practice, you may well want to extend the timescales for your procurement process. You may actually want to think about suspending the procurement process. But what I think is a lot more difficult is if you've started a procedure under the open or restricted, and then suddenly think, actually, I need to switch procedure because it's become more urgent. I think that is a very difficult situation because you get into issues of whether or not you are changing the parameters of the competition such that it gives rise to the risk of challenge due to modification. one of the questions that has been raised is how long, if you've actually gone through a procurement process, carried out your evaluation and decided to appoint a supplier, how long that period of time is that you can actually suspend your procurement process. And there's no clear answer to this, but you have to think about whether circumstances are going to change so much between the decision to award and when you want to actually enter into the contract, whether it is fair to carry on continuing to award the contract, or whether actually whether you could be at risk of a challenge from a party saying, actually, the whole climate is now changed and the requirements potentially have changed, so it's unfair to carry on awarding that particular contract. And another word of caution is last year there was a case about abandoning procurements. That's the Amy and Highways Agency case. Previously, if you wanted to abandon a procurement process, you could do that with very little risk. But just to flag up now that case says that in some circumstances there may be a risk if you abandon a procurement without good reason. Extending existing contracts may well be something that you want to think of to cover that space where your procurement is taking longer. So for existing contracts, just a reminder of the most common grounds in which you might want to extend your contract to ensure continued supplies. And those are regulations 71(1)(b). This is where you have a need for additional work, services and supplies that weren't initially contemplated by the contract but are required due to urgency and unforeseen circumstances, and regulation 72(1)(c), which permits contract variation due to unforeseen circumstances. Now, the PPN 120 specifically talks about the grounds for varying existing contracts, but I just wanted to clarify one particular point, because they talk about the thresholds. So if you are going to rely upon this particular provision, the value of the extension must be less than 50% of the original contract value. But what's not made clear in the PPN is also that it must be below the relevant procurement threshold. So clearly, if you're talking about a contract for supplies or services, then you're looking at sub £100,000, which may not be very much if it's a particularly large contract, and therefore you may not be able to rely on that particular provision. The other ground, of course, for changing your contract is to reflect changes to the payment provisions, which fits neatly in with PPN 220, which we're going to talk about now. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. PPN 220. Some of you may have already received requests for continued payment by suppliers quoting PPN 220. Now, understanding what PPN 220 means in practice raises a number of particular issues. Maybe that some of the some of your institutions are facing a lot of financial pressure, and therefore having to continue to pay suppliers when you're not sure whether you're going to get funding to cover some of your losses can be maybe politically not very desirable. The other thing is that PPN 220 effectively overrides the contractual position that you've already agreed with the supplier, and that feels a very peculiar set of circumstances. It's worth flagging that the headline about PPN 220 is the requirement to continue to pay suppliers. But I just want to unpick that a bit, because it's not necessarily quite as straightforward as that, as I want to go on to explain. And the analysis, it can be quite complicated. But just I think it's really important to understand the rationale for PPN 220. So if you could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the guidance note says that the objective of supplier relief is to preserve the supply chain, to enable suppliers to resume normal contract delivery once the outbreak is over, and to ensure continuity of the public service. So it's very important. This is all about ensuring continuity of the public service by making sure that suppliers have the relevant cash flow. All right. So whilst there is a provision that says you have to pay suppliers as quickly as possible, it's also worth noting that it says that you have to put in place a number of measures to ensure cash flow. So that may not always mean just paying suppliers as quickly as possible. So we're going to explore that a bit more. You have to identify the at-risk suppliers, and the note covers goods, services, and minor works. As I said earlier, there is a particular regime for construction contracts, for large works contracts, if you're carrying out a particularly large project involving construction contracts. Now that's outside the scope of the talk for today. So that is what is covered, but actually it's worth thinking about what is not covered, because there may be a number of contracts in your portfolio which are not covered by PPN 220. So the next slide talks about what is not covered. Brilliant, thank you. So my view is that concession contracts are not covered by PPN 220 on the basis that the whole structure of a concession contract is that it's the supplier who takes the risk. And therefore it would be unfair, and actually contrary to the principles of a concession, that the contracting authority, who may be paying a proportion or may be paying a contribution towards some of the services that are paid, particularly catering contracts, that actually that you should have to continue to pay them. There's a different procurement regime for concession contracts, and it's that's reflected that actually the obligations are different. Equally, the guidance note makes it clear that there's no obligation to pay under a contract when there's no minimum volume commitment. Now that may be, for example, where you have got a framework agreement in place, or in fact where you've got an agreement which is in some elements equivalent to a concession contract, but it doesn't actually comply completely with the requirements for a concession contract. But often you'll have, so for example, a catering contract where there is no, or somebody talked about a laundry contract that they were looking at, that there is no minimum volume commitment in relation to the amount of the laundry that's put through the supplier. Now, we've been having a lot of internal discussions about whether or not the supplier relief under 220 also applies where you've got furlough, where an employer has decided to invoke the furlough scheme. Now, our view on this, well, that the PPN clearly says that if the you only have to pay a supplier who is able to carry on performing a contract. Now, if you have a supplier who has decided to furlough their staff, then they clearly can't carry on performing the contract. That is, I think my position on this has been slightly refined, because you may have a circumstance whereby you can perform part of the contract, but actually, due to access requirements to the university, you can't perform the whole contract. Now, there's also a question which has not been answered by the PPN, but I just wonder, where a supplier is in breach, whether the obligation to supply, to continue to pay the supplier, continues. And I think that my point here is that there's an interrelationship between the contract provisions and whether or not, if you continue to pay, that might prejudice your contract position. So I think that needs to be looked at quite carefully. And finally, a point to note that research contracts are not covered. Going on to the next slide, please. So what I want to talk about in the next slide is really what you should, if you identify a contract that has is caught by PPN 220, what processes do you need to put in place? You need to identify those suppliers that are likely to be at risk. Now, there's no threshold in the PPNs for saying whether a particular contract is more important than another, and there's no value there. But the Cabinet Office guidance says that it's anticipated that a lot of suppliers are going to be potentially at risk, although the discretion lies with the contracting authority. So you also need to consider what measures you can put in place to ensure the supplier cash flow. Now, the PPN is in force up until the 30th of June 2020, so there's an obligation to carry on putting in measures till the 30th of June 2020. We don't know clearly whether that is likely to be extended or not. So going down to the next slide, please. Okay, all right. So if you identify a supplier that needs help, there are a number of things that you should need to consider. Do you carry on paying them under their normal contracting payments for 3 months? If you're going to do that, how do you calculate the method of payment? It may be that it's for a fixed fee every month, in which case it's fairly straightforward. However, if there is a fee that varies, the guidance is to say that you take into account the average of the last 3 months' payments. Now, it's important to note that in taking into account the average of the last 3 months' payments, you have to disregard any breaches in service levels because of failure to perform due to COVID. Now, it may be the case, and my next slide talks about the considerations, that actually you feel that it may not be appropriate to continue to pay the contractual payments, particularly if there is no, the service is completely interrupted. And there may be an alternative measure that you want to place, which instead of paying contractual payments, actually you make payments to cover the losses that the supplier is incurring. So that it may be preferable to actually look at their balance sheets and look to pay for their losses on an open book basis. And I'll talk about the circumstances and decide which measures are going to be more appropriate. But once you've decided on the appropriate approach and had a discussion as to how your revised payment is going to work, you should make sure that you record those details in your contract. The Model Interim Payment Terms Guidance sets out a very useful wording to use, but there are a number of points that I also just wanted to make sure that you include as part of your agreement. The reconciliation of payments and clawback provision. If, for example, it turns out somebody's been claiming furlough as well as being continued to be supported under PPN 220, there may be circumstances in which you want to exercise clawback. And if you've made an advance payment for services or supplies that subsequently are not able to be delivered, then you might want to actually claw back some of that provision as well. You should also provide for monitoring and auditing of the books to make sure that the supplier is claiming properly for its losses. The guidance note is silent on whether or not there is a duty to mitigate, but I think the general principle here is that what is clear is that suppliers should not be overcompensated for their losses. Going down to the next slide, please. I talked about some of the relevant considerations that you needed to take into account. Sorry, there's a slide, next slide. Perfect, thank you. In deciding whether you continue to pay as normal or whether you should look to pay a supplier on the basis of open book costs. And I'd say the following considerations are should be taken into account. Can you still effectively can you deliver this service, or is the supplier able to deliver the services, or actually is it very difficult because access to the universities is very, very restricted? If you've got a service, for example, for catering or cleaning, and it relies on the full number of students being there, it may be that the supplier can't provide a full service, but can provide a more restricted service. If you've got services, I'm never aware of some universities that are looking at using their halls of residence to be deployed for other uses, for example, for use by the NHS, and it may be that a supplier can recover some of their costs that way. Another, I think, very important question is to ask what is you as a member receiving funding for? And I think there's a good argument for saying that actually, if you are not receiving funding from public sources for a particular good or service, and that is one that it normally would be paid for by way of the student loans or for the students, that there's an argument that you shouldn't necessarily be passing it through to the suppliers. However, if you are clearly receiving funding for education and research from government, that clearly is something that should be passed through. Just in terms then of what you should be doing now, just to wrap up very quickly, what I would say is that if you haven't already started pulling together your key list of contracts and identifying suppliers at risks, you should be doing that and approaching them rather than waiting for letters from the suppliers to come to you to start the dialogue and have a discussion as to how you are going to ensure their cash flow going forward. And ultimately, it's in the best interests to cooperate, particularly if you've got a long-term contract that's still running to make sure that the suppliers carry on in good faith and that you are able to resume normal service as soon as possible. And make sure that you record your agreement by way of a contract of variation. I talked about the areas for clarification on the next slide. I think there is a point to check, particularly with the Department of Education in relation to additional financing. I think one of the questions that was raised is, are additional finances going to be available for culture institutions? I think that's something to check with the relevant parent body. To check the interrelationship with other schemes, for example, for furlough. And additional point with, there's an additional point about if you're a charity, you have to consider whether or not the obligation to pay for under PPN 220 is consistent with your charitable obligations. Now, there is a potential point that actually ensuring continuity of supply may be consistent with the charitable obligations, but I think that is an area for follow-up with the charities, for those that, education institutions that are charities, that would be grateful for clarification from OFS. And very importantly, make sure that you keep records of all your decision-making processes. So if I could go to the next slide, please, my final slide. We talked about areas for further clarification. We've talked about record keeping. Make sure you keep records for your Regulation 84 reports. Yeah, so key messages: keeping records, be transparent, and always maintain good communications, because that's really important. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was absolutely fantastic, and I think we'll have answered a number of questions that people had. For those of you who have submitted questions in the Q&A facility, those are being looked at right now, and they will be addressed when we get to our Q&A session just after 11:30.